This morning we're fitting the piston to the rod of Steve's S3 Silver Cloud 3 or F3 engine. Some of the important points that we need to discuss are the small end bushing. When the bushing's put in and honed, the pin can't drop through. It can't be loose enough to drop through. Now, if you warm it up with your hand, it will change. But if it's in there, it's got to be a push through that you've got to be able to push it through. If it's any more loose than that, you're going to end up in a very short time having a knock from the small end pin. So whenever your engine machine man does it, he's got to make that so that's a push through, not seized up, but it's got to be pushed through or it's too loose. The other thing that most of the machine shops do for you is they resize the bottom end of your rod, because after all those years of being round and round, they do get misshapen. So our machine shop, he resizes that and puts the bushing in and then makes it to the point that the pin only goes through. It's quite clear in the Rolls-Royce workshop manual, the engine workshop manual, how tight that is. It's not anything that isn't been around for all the years of the car, so that's an important point. So we're going forwards, we've got to put the piston on the rod in the right place. So what you end up with is you've got cutouts there that stop the bearing from spinning. So these bearing cutouts, as we'll call them, go up towards the camshaft. So they go in there that way. So they're going to the top, if you like, or whatever. So having a directional piston, we need to put the piston on the right spot. You can see there's an arrow there, which means the front of the engine. These pistons are made in such a way that they're off center because they're threes. The Cloud 2s and S2s are not, but the Cloud 3s are. So it's important to get these on in the right spot. So what we do is we go and we've got to put these clips on. Now, it's a very interesting thing, this clip. Then in the old days, we used to have a clip with two holes in it. You put it in, you put it clipped. Now they give you this clip like that. You can see it's a sprung-loaded clip that you wind into the hole. It's a little frustrating for an old man with arthritis to put in. I watched a YouTube video and the chap that was demonstrating it was a whole hell of a lot younger than me. And what he said is you put it in like so, you push down with your fingernail into the hole and you wind it in. And you just push it in. Well, my fingers don't work that well. So I went to another video with an American old guy putting them in. And he said you take a small screwdriver and you just ease them in, whereas the other guy said don't use a screwdriver because you'll scratch the piston. Well, age has taught the old guys not to scratch the piston and use a screwdriver. So that's what we're going to do. So we've got this ring and we've got it into the start of the ring into the piston, the groove that's cut into the piston. My fingernails are pretty good, but I'm unable to do it. So what you've got to do is you've got to work this ring, keeping it pushed into the groove. You've got to work it into the hole, be it that. So we're almost in, so we're just going to push in now at that point where that groove is and push that in, and then we're going to bring it back into the groove like so. When we do the other one, for once the piston pin's in, you won't have to It's a struggle.
Okay.
What we're going to do is we're going to put a little bit of moly grease on the bushing there because it'll be a while before it gets some oil on the startup, so we want to make sure that we're not spoiling our clearance on that point. We've got the cutouts going up towards the camshaft. We've got the arrow at the front of the piston, and we're going to just push our piston pin in, get it nice and straight so it slides right in like that. Make sure the rod is good and straight. You can either go against that side or you can bring it back towards the pin here. Nice and gentle, little bit of wiggle. Slides right in. Once you're straight, push it all the way in, and now you've got the groove for the other clip. So with the support of the pin, hopefully this clip will go in a little more easily. So we'll push that down all the way around. Moving around. Moving around. There you go. So that one was a bit easier.
There we go.
One thing to do is to just check that your piston rings have the correct gap. With the Aries pistons, it gives you the gap sizes they recommend on the box, but it's always good just to be sure that you've got a correct gap. I just put them into the liner like so, and then just check that the correct feeler gauge will go into the groove. The gap on these was 16, and I've got a 15 here which goes in and out easily. It goes from about 15 to 25, and that's well within limits. So you need to just check that your first 3 piston rings have the correct gap. As they drop down the piston, the gap gets considerably bigger. It's in the Rolls-Royce manual, should you want to look at those rings, or it's on the box, in the Aries box that the pistons come in. So that's just a quick tip.
Right, go.
Okay. So I put the spreader for the oil control rings on first. You can see that I've got them going up there. The rails, if you like, or the rings themselves, you just push in to the bottom. Want to make sure you got in there, because they've got a support on the inside of the concertina type thing. And I also want to keep everything, all the gaps, in a different spot. We'll talk about that later, but it's easier if you keep them spread out at this point, otherwise you've got to move them. So that's the oil control ring. We've got a third ring, which is the bottom ring, and the ring is pretty basic. There is a dot on the ring that needs to go up. The dots always go up. And what I do is I put the ring at that point there, not in the groove, and I just slide it around and down, and then let it go into its groove. And there you go, it's pretty straightforward. And then we take the second ring, again we're looking for the dot. You can see the dot by my thumbnail there. Again, I just put that onto the land, if you like, of the piston, push it over and push that in. And then
Are
this
you
is
going to talk about gapping the pistons?
all right. Stop the thing.
Go.
So we're putting the top ring on. We keep the dot up like the other ones. We're going to push it on the piston like so. Put it in the groove, and that's the piston rings on the piston. Okay, so each liner is machined off on this surface. The thickness of this ring is above there by 2/1000. The lip and this, the recess in there is 2/1000 lower than the thickness there. So this then sits up by 2/1000, and the cylinder head gasket and the cylinder head then keep the liner tight in the block, or the crankcase, or the block, whatever you want to call it. So these are sealed with 3 rings. The 2 thick rings go on the bottom, and they go on those 2 lands there. The top one is to keep the coolant around the water jacket in there. The other one is to keep the oil into the crankcase, or the, I keep calling it crankcase, it's actually a block. And that stops the oil coming up there. And on this groove, this machined lower spot, goes where that hole is. So should any coolant get by the seal, it comes out of the side of the block at that point, rather than going into the oil. What we do is we use a sealant, a Dow Chemical 732 sealant, to seal the backside of these sealing rings into the area that may be a little bit corroded from the years that it's had coolant in there. So what I do is I put a good coat of sealant around the backside of the O-ring. I'm pretty generous with it, because if there is a groove, you want it to fill it up. You don't need it leaking, so what isn't needed will just squeeze out anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this one in the upper one, which is my big concern, because this is the one that's had the coolant up against the edge of it all those years, all that time. Make sure I get it well into the groove, because you don't, if you've got it half out of the groove and you do push the liner in, obviously it's going to jam, or at very least it's going to squeeze the liner perhaps, and make the hole no longer round. So you need to make sure it's well in the groove. And of course, when you're cleaning out your block and your water jacket, you want to make sure there's no lumps in any of the grooves. You want to make sure that your grooves are free of any high spots that would push on the rubber, hence pushing on the O-ring that will push on the liner. Follow. So this bottom one, which is just to keep the oil in, I'll give it a bit of a coating, but again, I'm not quite as concerned with this one. And I'll spread it out a bit once I get enough on. I'm just going to slide it around. That's your main seal. Also have a seal around the top here, this smaller O-ring. I'll just put a bit on that. hands.
Oh.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we ease the liner into the top ring nice and even, and we make sure it goes down into the bottom ring. I'm using an aluminum hammer. You can hear that go all the way home. You feel there's a little bit of a thing there, and that's the liner fitting. So when we put the piston into the liner, what I like to do is I like to get the gaps on the piston rings all on the thrust side of the piston. And what that does is, as the piston is coming up on the firing stroke, the firing of the piston pushes the piston over to the thrust side, and that in turn closes the gaps up, so you have a big piece of ring that fills up the gap on that side, because as the piston comes this way, you now have the gaps closed, so the ring is complete, which will stop any kind of blow-by with the piston, so hopefully keeping your compression up after the rings have worn some. So that's what we do. We keep the gaps over to the thrust side, so that when the ring goes like that, you've got a full seal. Anyway, I've put some oil around the rings so that they can, when you first start it, it's not going to be scraping up and down the bore. I've put a bit of oil onto my bearing so that that's not dry. This is engine rebuilding oil. And now I've got to put my spring compressor on. So I take it to the vise, close up the vise gently.
What kind of jaws you got in there?
Got some aluminum jaws to protect the rod from being marked by the nasty vise jaws. I've got my spring compressor now, so I get my rings so they're not going to bend or crack. Open the spring compressor, and where I position the spring compressor is there. Because of the studs on the block, you need to put your spring compressor at the point at which you can work around the studs. I take the spring compressor well down. You can see that band there is down on the rings, so that you've closed the rings into the grooves really well. Tighten that up. We then drop the piston into the hole, making sure, as I spoke earlier, we've got the cutouts there and the arrow there, which is going to go to the forward end of the engine. Place this in the hole. What we generally do, you take the shaft of the hammer and I level up the piston so that it's straight ahead, and then I'm just going to tack the piston in, holding the spring compressor
What's Jim doing over here?
My assistant over there is directing the bolts, the conrod bolts, around the journal so that we don't hit the crankshaft. What's up?
You got a ways to go.
I'm just pointing. You got that far to go.
Okay. Okay, so we've got the piston rings into the bore, and now I'm going to push it in a bit with the instructions of the assistant, who's going to make sure it goes onto the journal. And he's probably going to have to push the other rod up a little bit so that this one's got room to go. So we might have to push it upwards a bit. So I'm just going to put a little more assembly lube onto the bearing, and making sure that my cutout and the two cutouts go together. I'm going to slip that onto the conrod. I want to keep them even because that's the way they'll go on easily. Working past this rod just a little bit. Another look, just make sure everything's still good. Nope, my bearing came out, so we got the bearing in properly. That came out there because I went uneven, so I have to feel for it. Oh, the rod isn't down quite far enough, so we're going to push the rod down a little bit. So that's now touching the crank. We've got that closed up. Put a couple of nuts on and nip it down. Just use a speed brace to join them up so there's no movement of the bearing as we turn it over for the next one. Just a little nip. We will of course torque these down to the correct torque setting, but right now we just need to make sure they don't move. So what we're doing is we're just using the torque wrench to tighten up the nuts. We're going to go down to 35 pounds. I go from side to side so everything stays even. And we'll go through all of the rods. We'll do two at a time. We'll bring it around and do that. Hold the block for a minute, would you? With the pistons and with the rings and everything, obviously there's a certain amount of resistance. We checked the crank when we did the mains to make sure we had a free spinning engine, and that's probably on a different